Hi everyone, here's a few slides that I wanted to add. The PowerPoint has already been posted, but I thought I'd do a quick voiceover. So these slides were added because the two teams decided to talk about context of natural disaster rather than conflict. Just wanted to add a few comments there on the dimensions of conflict and post-conflict. So we're going to obviously cover what I've just said, education in context of emergency, not covered by the teams. So education in context of armed conflict and post-armed conflicts, and examine specific skills that come into play in this context with regards to mental health and well-being, such as trauma-informed education. I wanted to make sure we had something on that so that you had that topic and that theme covered as well. So what is education in context of emergency generally? Sort of an overview to both the dimensions. So obviously education in context of conflicts could be war, could be revolution, could be all sorts of things. Rare but exist if the conflict is long and there's no hope of peace. So that is happening more and more, unfortunately. So look at Sudan, for example, and all sorts of regions where now the conflicts have been ongoing. So it's about rebuilding structures in a very unsteady and wobbly political environment. Education in context of post-conflicts, well, we have a lot more of that. Now, the reason why I say it's rare in the first place is, again, we have the problem of insurance. So you're going to find that even most NGOs that are trying to work in areas of conflicts normally get pulled out because they don't get insurance coverage. So there's natural sort of liability um, limits to how much of that education in context of conflicts we actually see. In context of post-conflicts, we see a lot. So as soon as the conflict is over, normally insurance sort of relaxes and risk management sort of decides that there's a possibility that people still get pulled out of that. You'll see that UN bases and things like this will be working just in time, so they'll be pulled out if things get less steady. But normally, as soon as the conflict ends, then we see a lot more initiatives with regards to education post-conflict. It represents a large part of global education in terms of literature and scholarship, so don't ignore it. We also see within that terminology education in refugee context, and we'll look at some examples in the coming slide. That might be well after the post-conflicts, right? Ongoing situations of refugees. And that's a growing phenomenon in global education and in critical pedagogy as well. You might be interested, for those of you who've taken the course, that there's a lot of critical pedagogy being written in conflicts in the context of refugee camps, for example. Education context and natural disaster. We're not going to cover that again because we've covered it already with the both teams. And that's a frequent as well important part of global education scholarship. So education in the context of conflicts, you have an example, for example, at the moment in the Syrian conflict. As I've said to you, there's not much going on because NGOs will not be allowed usually under sort of the danger and the risk management sort of protocols. We usually not be allowed to go there. Education post-conflicts, now you have a lot. Afghanistan, Iraq, and you have Sudan as well, many more around the world. Education refugee context, you have the Rohingya crisis going on at the moment, but before that, throughout the 90s, you had, for example, the Mozambique refugee camps in Southeast Africa. So millions of Mozambican refugees in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, moving across borders in South Africa and being there for sometimes a decade, right? So reorganizing educational structure within those population displacements. And then we have education in context of natural disaster. We've had one on Katrina, but think as well about the Thailand tsunami that caused similar issues, the Haiti earthquakes, and we discussed that in the presentation. Some interesting films. I think it's always good when we can go to popular culture and see how those topics arise. So, The Power of One looks at apartheid in South Africa. Now, all those films are done from the perspective of youth, of sometimes youth or long-term sort of growing structure. Power One is about youth. So seen through the apartheid and the crisis in South Africa, seen through the eyes of youth. So it's relevant to us in terms of education. In context of conflict. Around the Rwanda crisis, you've got the Rwanda genocide, so Je serai la main du diable and Hotel Rwanda, two films that are really potent and very powerful that you should try and see if you've not seen them. And the two last ones, I think they were great examples when we talked about one of the difficulties of creating these initiatives is to remain neutral. And that's a big part of these two films and of the crisis generally, is of the UN having to remain neutral while trying to rebuild structures in an environment where they would have wanted to take action but not being able to. And that's one of the dilemmas in this area of education, which is sometimes difficult to handle from a personal basis, from in terms of personal resilience and individuals' resilience within those efforts. Some more efforts. So there are a lot of films that have been done around French films, particularly, have been done around the German occupation, right, which lasted 5 years, and the Shoah and the removal of Jews to concentration camps in France. So three films which I recommend: A Sac de Billes, Les choristes, Au revoir les enfants. The two last ones are fairly old, very, very well known, and have won lots of prizes. And actually, I've encountered lots of English-speaking colleagues and friends who've already seen them, so you may already have. A Sac de Billes is a more recent film, which was done on a very famous French novel, which follows two young kids who are told by the parents that they have to. If you don't know, France was invaded in a progression. So first of all, half of France was invaded. So the reflex of a lot of people, especially Jewish families, was to try and get to the south. Eventually, the south was also invaded by the Germans, and then the transfer of Jews to concentration camp happened there too. But for the first 2 years of the war, a lot of the challenge for a lot of Jewish families was to escape the north and go to the south. And this is a story of two kids who were told by the parents, go without us and just make your way. And so it's about their childhood really on the road, and trying to educate themselves and trying to remain sort of sane and find a routine while they're left to their own devices in a context of conflict happening around them. Very, very powerful book, and it's recently been turned into a film as well. So if you get a chance to see it, it's interesting. About Afghanistan, you have The Kite Runner as well. About the Second World War from the Pacific, you have Empire of the Sun, story of a little English boy stuck basically in Asia during the Japanese invasion, and then Hope and Glory as well. So have in the coming weeks when we're at home more, have a look at these films, because they're also a good way of getting your mind around some of the themes that were discussed in this section. Two books as well. So Daler, which relates to the Rwanda, Hotel Rwanda, and the other films I've mentioned about Rwanda. It's his testimony on the ground from being a UN sort of general, and his frustration in remaining neutral and having to witness some of the things he witnessed, but not being able to take action. And I'm Malala, as you know, who suffered oppression at the hands of the Taliban and persecution, and wrote a book, and now is at Oxford and has been able to escape all that. How does it relate specifically to global education, this notion of education in the context of conflict and post-conflicts? Well, I think you will see the links as being very explicit, because it goes back to the theoretical origins of global education. If you go back to the first section, I think section 2, when we discussed history, we talked about the foundations of global education being in peacekeeping, and particularly emerging out of the post-war creation of the UN and UNESCO. So we're right back there, right? Global education hasn't forgotten its roots, and it still sees as an important part of its work the effort of creating and maintaining and recreating educational structure in context of post-conflicts, with the aim of stabilizing regions and of creating or aiding and facilitating peace. Also, the notion of aid offered to those most needed, from global north to global south. And with you through this sort of section of scholarship, you will see the importance of education as a brick for the creation of normality. So it's not just creating education for the sake of education, because it's important, obviously, when population is displaced or things have been destroyed, but it's also the notion that it's through education that you create peace. So you get people back to normality by actually very quickly getting education up and running. And that's the first brick in people's recreation of a feeling of normality and being able to create other structures and other routines. So some of the specific difficulties of such environments and situations. And this, to some extent, also applies to education in context of natural disaster that we've seen, but in other respects, it differs a little bit. So finding dedicated stuff. Obviously, you've got to work with people who are able to work and uproot themselves and be constantly in what we describe as this just in time, right? Do I go? Do I stay? Can I work today? Can I not work? Should I leave and come back later? It takes a particular type of staff to be able to manage those conditions, and sometimes it's very difficult to find staff that have that. Maintaining staff motivation, what you can see through the literature is that people are often very keen to help and they go into these environments, but sometimes they're young, sometimes they're underprepared, sometimes they have their own baggage, and it's very hard to keep them motivated when they're faced with overwhelming situation, because that tends to bring out all the things that you've not dealt with before you went into this context. So in terms of education, we see a lot of very keen educators, but they don't often last very long on the field, because then it suddenly brings back all sorts of other issues as they're trying to deal with what they're seeing. Working with limited and precarious resources. As we've said, often no technology, no Wi-Fi access, no computer and hardware, sometimes no classroom space, very large classes, mixed age groups. So it's actually fairly developed educational skills. And one of the problems is often we have very young people, very young educators who may not have the skills to actually do that juggling act with few resources. So there's an inherent contradiction that the people that we most need in this context are more expert teachers, more advanced teachers, but we generally don't see them in this context. We see more young, early career sort of professionals. Securing insurance for staffing on terrain work. So I've explained this in different environments. It affects all of us. It affects us in the global north in terms of school outings and field day, day out. But it affects the global south as well. All of these organizations are depending on insurance, and often, despite their intentions, despite their mandate, they have to put an end to some of what they do simply because they can't get insurance. You cannot consider being a global north organization, even an ONG, and sending people out on the field unless you have an insurance company that's actually covering you for that risk, because otherwise you'll be hit with liability, and so it's just not possible. Inherent transient nature of many of these school settings. So as we've seen, often it's just in time. You may be in a region, refugee camps get moved. Those populations that have been sort of forced to resettle often attempt to make their way back. So you may be in refugee camps. So a lot of these stuffs are working really on the sort of nomadic sort of settings, and it's very difficult, as you can imagine. Monitoring the psychological welfare of staff. So obviously you're very concerned about your clients and about the clientele, but obviously it's also, there's going to be this ongoing sort of work around your staff's own PTSD and exposure to trauma. And again, it's linked partly with concerns with liability. And so we have a vicarious liability. When you're an employer, you have liabilities that you must take as an employer. And so you have that employee responsibility of making sure that your staff are not exposed to things they can't handle. And then there's the philanthropic, simply of wanting your staff to obviously be well. And that can become very, very complex. And often the other issue is that the monitoring skills and stuff are not necessarily on terrain. So you're hoping to do this from base, often in global north, to see what's happening on terrain. Often with lacking technology, not always being able to do all the communication that you want. So it can get very, very tricky. And yet that responsibility is not eroded. You keep having that responsibility just as if they were back in the global north. Dealing with inherent pedagogical issues. So as we've said, these classrooms, hang on, I'm going to move my camera. These classrooms are multi-age most of the time. Absence of foundations, they may not have at the groups that they the grades that they've had before. You're trying to create skills often with no foundations. Cognitive impairments, as everywhere, but you may have more cognitive impairment as a result of the conflict. Disability as everywhere, but you may have a higher percentage than what we see in normal classrooms because of the conflicts, loss of limb. Think of the issues with mines around the world and things like this. But then you have PTSD, you have trauma that add itself to that. So it makes up for a really complex classroom sort of landscape, again, which maybe some of the young teachers that are being sent out to these contexts may not possess the skills required to do essentially what is, extreme differentiation in the hope of inclusion in these classrooms that often don't make much sense in classic terms, traditional terms. Issue of maintaining neutrality in conflicts. I think a lot of people that work in these organizations find that very difficult in psychological terms, to be in the middle of fighting, rivalry, unrest, civil unrest, and not to take sides, because often those roles have the implicit sort of understanding that they will be observers and neutral and mediators, and they will try and do what they can, but they don't get involved in the conflicts themselves, however difficult that might be. And think of the Sudan, for example, in people who've been working in Sudan for the last few years, where we see genocide and we see these things happen, but your presence on the ground usually contains the inherent condition that you are not taking sides in the conflicts. And then once you manage that, then you have the opposite issue, the sort of the reverse side of the coin, is that if you manage that neutrality, then you are criticized back home in the global north for being present on the ground and doing nothing. And I think that's what people, for example, the Kaskabur found very difficult in Rwanda, and they're still finding very difficult in the Western African conflicts. They are there for peacekeeping. They find it very hard psychologically to maintain that neutrality. But when they do, they get criticized and grilled by the press for not doing more while they're there. So there's this inherent ambivalence and contradiction in their mission, which I think people find very, very difficult. And Dallaire's, sort of memoirs, Agir à la main du diable, is really about that, about this impossibility of sort of reconciling that role, being forced into that neutrality and then being sort of crucified for that neutrality. So this, as you see, is quite complex. It's not just a matter of creating the programs, but it's a matter of looking at all these repercussions that are involved in their daily running. And I want to talk particularly about importance of trauma-informed care, because it becomes very, very important to some degree as well in context of natural disaster, although at least that's often more short-lived than in the context that we're looking at in terms of conflicts and post-conflict. So what is trauma-informed care? I'm just going to read through the slide here. Is the notion that some of the behavior we see in learners can at times be explained in no other way than by presupposing the existence of some form of trauma. So you have an explosion in your class, you're having a normal day, well, as much as it can be normal in this context. You're tackling a theme or tackling an issue, and suddenly you may have a student who erupts emotionally. And in your analysis, you see no possible connection between the facts and the things that have happened in the classroom and that emotional reaction. So that often is what trauma-informed care is about, is actually finding ways to deal with this when you have a strong emotional challenging behavior, strong emotional sort of manifestation in the classroom that has really no link to anything objective having happened during that classroom. So when that happens, you presuppose that there's actually trauma, and that unwittingly you have actually walked onto the cause of the trauma. So the aim of trauma is informed education is not to explore the trauma. You're not a psychologist. You're not there to go on that journey with the students, but it's just to create awareness in the learners, the teacher, so you don't walk again on those areas that are sensitive. You can see how this is going to be extremely important in the context that we're talking about. So what are its origins? So its origins of trauma-informed care, it comes from Indigenous education, and both in practice and in terms of scholarship. Educators within this context having sort of put forward the notion of transgenerational trauma because of residential schools. So coming from really the observations of people working in indigenous communities in indigenous education, saying some of the reactions that we're seeing, some of the emotional manifestations in the classroom have no connection to what is actually happening in that classroom. So it must have a connection to something else. And there comes the hypothesis of transgenerational trauma, saying what we're seeing really is nothing to do even what happened in the day of the students. It's got to do with this trauma that is carried by the community and then manifests itself in ways that we may find random, but are not random for the learner. And then it has spread from there. So it's developed quite extensively, mostly in Canada, around Indigenous education, and then spread to obviously any other areas where trauma happens, particularly for us, areas of conflict. Why is it relevant to global education? Well, obviously, as we've just discussed, many of the students that we're going to have in classrooms in context of classrooms in post conflict have suffered trauma. And we are busy re-establish a sense of normality, saying everything is back to normal, but we're going to see these eruptions. And then it's a matter of, yes, recreating a feeling of normality, but also taking the time to make sure that we avoid areas that could possibly create emotional reactions because they take the learner back to the trauma, the source of the trauma. So what does trauma-informed care or trauma-informed education look like? So it's focused on developing the teacher's awareness around trauma, equipping teachers to recognize when a reaction is not proportionate or linked to ongoing events in the classroom. First, it's that identification piece, right? Make sure that, first of all, teachers are aware that trauma exists and that they are aware that sometimes what they see in front of them is a result of trauma, not a result of any of their action or other actions between peers in the classroom. And that therefore they should not react, because that's what we tend to do as teachers. We react to manifestations, but in fact to step back and say, I'm not going to react because the cause isn't here within the four walls of the classroom. Teachers must then hypothesize as to where the trauma lies and how best to avoid revisiting it for the students in the classroom. So it's about really creating a sensitivity and making sure you don't make the same mistakes twice. So it's not about exploring the trauma again. We're not psychologists. That's very important. It's not therapy. It's simply about creating a buffer of comfort for the learner. Okay, making sure you don't push into areas that you know are sensitive. And I've given you an example of trauma-informed care resource, which I picked up, and it's in community work, I think, or social work, but it's still going to be very relevant for you. And then you have the references. So we've covered all this, and then later tonight I will put another PowerPoint and another little video around global education in academia. In certain ways, we've looked at many aspects already, obviously internationalization, globalization. We've looked at all that already. And we've, to some extent, started to tackle the notion that if we want our teachers to be more prepared for global education in the classroom, we have to rethink pre-service teaching training. But now we also have to look at another area of scholarship called comparative international education, which is going to be very relevant for you in global education, but we haven't talked about it yet. So I'll just put a few slides on that just to open that window so that you know you've got that whole scholarship too that you can dig into, and that's going to be relevant for the purpose of global education. So bye for now. I hope you're doing well and you're finishing off your assignment slowly. As I said, we can take week 13. I have already almost counted that we're going to take week 13. So don't worry if you're a bit late on certain things. I'm in the process of marking assignment 4, and then I will jump on to assignment 7. So if you could finish your post with regards to media, and then I will tackle assignment 6, the blog, last, and we can do that into next week. So bye for now, and I'll speak to you soon.